Hello, my name is Gürkan. I'm a tourism professional and consultant for quite some time. I have education background from Boğaziçi University Tourism Department, Texas A&M University, Recreation National Parks and Tourism Sciences, and Istanbul Technical University on urban planning. And I have worked at numerous um, tourism master plan studies and projects all around the world. Thanks for having me. Um, Here, I'd like to talk about climate change and tourism. We can say every person on Earth has a duty to make an attempt to protect their own environment. In order to develop some measures to help in preservation of our planet, I'd like to take your attentions to climate change and how people perceive climate change in sustainable tourism. Tourism is the world's biggest industry, without doubt. With 10, $10 trillion in revenues, around 300 million people working in the industry, representing around 11% of global workforce. Because of its immense size, it has certainly great effects on environment and climate change. United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Tourism established a series of Sustainable Development Goals. Those are those famous SDGs, and by 2030, we are all aiming to reach to those targets. Sustainable development goals for tourism industry are quite related to Millennium Development Goals as well. Sustainable development and sustainability of tourism as a whole, thanks to the United Nations World Tourism Organization's emphasis, is tourism's most important topic today. Climate change is expected to have a significant impact on global tourism. Rising temperatures, changing raining patterns, sea level rise, and they all lead to environmental degradation and reduced availability of natural resources, and they all result in, unfortunately, hurricanes, floods, wildfires all around the world, and they all impact tourism because tourism is about the destination, and it relies heavily on natural resources, destinations, natural resources, we can say, and the duration and quality of tourism seasons. And they are all determined by climate conditions. So tourism and climate change, we can say, have a complicated relationship. Tourism industry is already being impacted by climate change in terms of investment, planning, operations on all sides. The direct and indirect consequences are accelerated through climate change and comprehensive government responses. And they all impact tourism competitiveness, sustainability, and tourism geography. Sustainable tourism development is, by any occurrence, related directly to economic expansion, and it amplifies security risks as well. Tourism is the reason of climate change and also the victim of climate change. Because in addition to being a victim of global warming, global tourism industry is also the one that is the reason, one of the main reasons of the issue. Around 8% of carbon emissions are produced worldwide from tourism alone. In 2019, sorry, in 2019 it increased to 11%, and 40% of the tourism industry uh, gas emissions comes from travel. There is nowhere to hide. Global tourism industry in the global tourism industry, there is a huge need to respond to the challenge of climate change. The most important task to prevent and manage the devastation of sustainable tourism brought by climate change is managing carbon risk associated with shift to a net zero economy. In order to achieve sectors gas emission reductions, global tourism industry has to show enormous efforts to decarbonizing the tourism industry, which may not be possible if we can speak the truth. After all, destinations that will be most negatively affected and impacted are the ones that are ultimately dependent on tourism. The tourism revenue generating countries are the ones most affected, in fact. Especially seaside and small island destinations will face the unfortunate economic decline and failure of welfare that's coming from tourism. The amount of household waste created surge as a result of rapid rise in visitors and locals. In attractive destinations, there is a significant increase in number of commercial facilities due to tourism. There is increase in car traffic, increase in flood of tourists, thus the destination long-term competitiveness and the good reputation is decreased. Tourism cannot be considered as sustainable until it reaches, or let's say it achieves, a degree of decarbonization consistent with the Paris Climate Accords. These are science-based policy objectives that all destinations have to be aligned with. According to United Nations, climate change is happening so rapidly and so badly, harming the very things that travelers travel across the world to see, from wildfires in Marmaris, Turkey, Greece, and from sea level rises in Solomon Islands and coral bleaching off the coast of Australia. Many experts predict that a large number of the world's islands will be submerged, such as Maldives, right? And the global warming and the sea level rise will certainly affect, uh, let's say maybe totally sweep out small islands. In short, many islands globally in tourism will be very badly affected. According to United Nations World Tourism Organization, the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action, they say, these are the articles coming from the declaration, support the global commitment to stop emissions by 2030 to reach net zero, deliver climate action plans within 12 months after signing the agreement, align plans with five pathways: declaration, measure, decarbonize, regenerate, collaborate, and finance, which didn't happen. Report publicly on annual basis on progress against the long-term targets, and working collaboratively, sharing good practices and solutions, and disseminate information among all the signature uh, countries. A net zero roadmap for travel and tourism was also published by WTTC, highlighting how the sector might go carbon free to protect both future of travel and tourism and the environment. So, so many declarations we have seen until now, and so many nations have signed them. What is the result? What is the result? Or we can ask, were there any solid results? Although the aviation sector contributed almost 4% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. It is predicted that with this rapid, uncontrolled growth, airline sector will produce up to 40% of world's carbon dioxide by 2050. That's incredible. I mean, it's really bad. Sea levels have risen throughout the Korean Peninsula, just to give you an example, and almost 2 millimeters per year over the past 40 years. And the famous Jeju Island of Korea, the sea level expected to increase by 65 centimeters in the second half of 21st century. That means the island will face severe natural disasters and sea level rise. Therefore, no more tourism, maybe no more residency at all. Some specific impacts of climate change may have on global tourism. I just wanted to summarize. Reduced availability of natural resources as climate change leads to changes in rainfall patterns. Water scarcity will be a problem. Thus, destinations which are heavily depending on water activities like boating, swimming will be highly affected. Damage of infrastructure. Climate change certainly, uh, the severe disasters, natural disasters, damage tourist infrastructure such as hotels, resorts, and most important of all, transportation networks. Changes in demand. Climate change can also impact the demand of certain types of tourism. For example, warmer temperatures may lead to increased demand for beach vacations. However, the existing beach vacations will be so hot, tourists will be just not interested in visiting those destinations. Antalya in Turkey is already getting warmer and warmer. And the shifts in wildlife populations. Climate change can cause shifts in wildlife populations in Africa, which can impact ecotourism activities. This can also lead changes in availability of wildlife viewing opportunities. And tourists who go to Africa to view wildlife, to watch wildlife, will not be able to see those animals because they will migrate. The overall impacts of climate change on global tourism are likely to be complex and varied, depending on a range of factors including location, tourism activities, regional climate conditions. However, it's clear that climate change will pose significant changes for tourism industries in the coming decades. So, there is an urgency to increase climate action in tourism industry, and that is, in my opinion, in so many people's opinion, is the top priority of tourism. Excuse me. Today's smart destinations, like European destinations in Barcelona or Venice, they're shifting their attention to how beneficial each visitor may be and working to maximize that value while minimizing negative effects of the climate. And instead of going for more and more tourists, now smart destinations start going for less number of tourists, less effects on destination. Of course, a higher quality tourists for better revenues. Smart grids and renewable energy generation, rooftop solars, wind energy, international connections to transmission and distribution lines. These things we will see a lot during the next decades. E-cars instead of regular cars, as long as power distribution allows. We don't want. Nowadays we see a lot of electrical cars around, which I don't have one, by the way. But if you are using an electric car, but putting the plug in on the wall where the electricity is generated through coal or natural gas, that doesn't mean anything. It just saves your car's carbon dioxide emission. That's it. So, green buildings, low carbon buildings, newly designed guideline systems for all types of constructions. We'll see more natural beauty, mountains, peaceful empty seashores, history and cultural destinations rather than luxury hotels in as tourist attractions. And destinations will certainly target for longer stay tourists because they take minimized time for local transport. Prefer serving local seasonal food wherever possible. This is called friendly food miles in sustainable tourism. Because transportation is around 19% of all carbon dioxide emissions in food system. Promote and apply zero plastic, zero disposable products wherever possible. Ecological education for children for the next generations. And promote airlines with sustainable aviation fuel. Those are biodiesels, but there are still not certain technological advancements. They are still a testing period. All seashore resort destinations must manufacture offshore wind farms. This is another result that was declared because if they can generate their own energy, then they will not be dependent on central grids, and they will use green energy, wind energy, and solar energy in their towns, so less carbon dioxide emissions. And after all this, my humble suggestions. Tourism needs to establish a high ambition scenario for itself and which it can shift towards actions that are highly efficient and emit fewer emissions. Those high ambitions are not easy to reach, and tourism industry must rapidly transition in order to achieve or at least get close to sustainable tourism goals and respond climate change challenge. So, no transition without transmission is a global motto for energy sector today. We must adapt tourism in this motto too. Renewable energy transmission lines are essential to reducing pollution, protecting climate, and preserving nature. The whole world is being revolutionized by transition of energy sources and the way we generate and use the energy. Green energy sources and the new technology energy sources like hydrogen use, etc., are now being announced as top priorities in energy sectors. Green Deal will certainly move and force the energy sector even more towards green energy sources and high technology adoption. Coal fired power is likely to leave the global electricity grid by the mid 2030s, at least in Europe, I believe. Transmission companies are forced to use as much locally produced manufactured green steel and components for transmission lines as possible. Eventually, technology has the potential to reduce one third of those emissions in energy sector. Tourism industry has to pass through a transition period. And this transition period, if we call it, there is no transition without transmission in global tourism. Um, I have listed some 7 items, and in the context of global tourism, this motto can be applied in number one, in communication, encouraging effective communication between stakeholders of tourism industry, including policymakers, businesses, and tourists themselves. This can include sharing the best practices and success stories and challenges. And my second um, idea that came to my mind was concept of cognitive climate change in tourism. I can explain it as is a shift of travelers' perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, and all their actions towards sustainable tourism practices. It's a response to growing concern about negative impact of tourism on the environment and the need to adopt more sustainable practices. Cognitive climate change certainly involves changing the ways tourists think about travel, and it will increase awareness about sustainable tourism and reducing waste, conserving energy and water, supporting local culture. Tourists may even be more willing to, let's say, to buy more expensive hotels because they have GSTC certifications, or to pay for more for flight tickets because they use biodata. So, change the way tourists think about the destination and based on their criteria in their mind. Cognitive climate change is important because it can lead to a positive impact of environment and local communities, and tourists will be more aware of the choices of destinations who have them, and it can lead to more sustainable tourism practices. In summary, cognitive climate change is a shift in tourist perceptions and attitudes towards a destination. Now, the third item would be digital transformation. Tourism is the first industry to adapt digital technologies when the internet started 20 years ago. And tourists' experiences and operational efficiency are all now dependent on technology, digital technologies. Tourists can be informed and educated through the same technology, through the same channels, travel portals, hotel websites, and giving them the message of how this destination, that destination specifically, is using um, right resources and decreasing carbon emissions and doing the best. Education, number four, providing education and training for sustainable tourism practices to industry professionals. And those industry professionals will train their own employees. Number five, collaboration and stakeholders. Stakeholders have to be engaged together, encouraging, facilitating knowledge sharing between, among themselves, and they will share information, resources, and expertise on sustainable tourism practices. Policymakers, certainly, government and regulatory bodies can develop policies and frameworks that can incentivize sustainable tourism practices. Why shouldn't the hotel get lower interest rate credits because they are using sustainable development goals, or they are trying to do things for that? And crisis management. Tourism industry is vulnerable to crisis like the one we had, the natural disaster in Turkey. And during those times, unorganization, political instability, a lot of things occur, and industry stakeholders and communities suffer. So, my whole idea of there is no transition without transmission in global tourism means that sustainable tourism practices cannot be achieved without effective communication and sharing information on these practices across the tourism industry and to the tourists themselves. To make, success, to make a successful transition towards sustainability, information and knowledge must be transmitted and received by all stakeholders. This includes tourism sector, policymakers, and tourists themselves. That's why we can maybe talk about it later, but Global Sustainable Tourism Council by United Nations, UNWTO is a part of it. GSTC is called. Has developed an accreditation body, and this platform is providing criteria to destinations to reach to those goals. And until now, the most solid and result-driven um, criteria are certainly uh, these GSTC criteria for a destination. Thank you very much for having me.